Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 13 about nurturing power. In this lesson, you'll learn about the Supreme Court managing perceptions, about the law as religion, about avoiding controversy, and following elite opinion. In the previous lesson, we learned about the power of the court, that it exercises through its function of interpreting laws for us, particularly the Constitution. And in that lesson, we talked about how that power is taken to such an extreme that you end up with quotes like this from former United States President, at the time future United States President, Woodrow Wilson, who was a political scientist when he said this, who said that the Supreme Court is a constitutional convention in continuous session, meaning that the Supreme Court was continually rewriting the Constitution. The fundamental rules of our society were constantly being amended and changed by the court. That impression is so powerful that a Supreme Court justice, a future Supreme Court justice, while he was a professor at Harvard Law School, went even farther to say that the Supreme Court is the Constitution. In other words, they are the fundamental law for our political community. That's about as powerful as you can get in our system of government. So, with that as background, we want to ask how the Supreme Court manages to maintain such power. Arguably, they are the most powerful branch of the three branches of the national government now, even though originally they were assumed that they would be the weakest. How do they get away with that? We can see part of the answer if we look at what the Supreme Court said about itself in a case from 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This was a decision that gave the Supreme Court the opportunity to overrule their abortion decision in Roe v. Wade. And many outside observers thought that they would overrule that decision. There are a bunch of reasons to think that that original decision was questionable, at least, particularly the way that it was argued was not the best. I should say the way that the decision was rendered by the Supreme Court was not the most logically persuasive. And so people who on the outside, when the Supreme Court took this case that was another abortion case that gave them a possibility of overruling Roe v. Wade, thought that they might well do so. Now, they ended up not overruling Roe v. Wade, and in the process of explaining themselves, they gave some remarkable insight into how they see themselves as an institution and how they believe they must act to maintain their power. In that case, the Supreme Court admitted that their power lies in their legitimacy, in other words, people accepting what they do. And they say that that's a product of the substance of what they do, but also the perception that people have of them. That's an amazing admission on their part, that their power is found in people's perception of them. And this then causes them to act in certain ways that will get people to accept their power and their position. Now remember, we talked previously in this course about how the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, and they don't have money to go buy an army. They can't force people to obey their decisions, so they have to somehow convince people to obey their decisions. And here in this Supreme Court case, they are saying that they do this, they get people to be convinced to obey their decisions by behaving in a certain way, presenting a certain image for people to see. So we learn from this that the Supreme Court actively nurtures certain perceptions of themselves in order to protect and sustain their power. An example of this is how the Supreme Court presents itself as almost a religious institution. Sort of a secular religion for our society. Now, that word secular generally means non-religious. And so what they're doing is our government, which is not religious, they are presenting themselves as an institution within it that can be treated with a religious sort of respect and devotion. And let me show you some ways in which they present themselves in this religious way. First of all, just like a religion, the United States Supreme Court has a revered text that they are the ones who then explain to the rest of us. In a religious faith, It may be scripture, that you have a minister or a priest or whatever it may be who teaches a congregation about. In the case of the Supreme Court, the sacred texts that they're explaining to us are the laws, and even more particularly the Constitution of the United States of America. And you can notice in America that many people have almost a religious devotion to that text. The Supreme Court then plays on this idea of they're the ones that are explaining a sacred text to us by presenting themselves as doing so in a sacred place. Now notice on the left here we have a picture of the Parthenon, an ancient Greek temple, and on the right the United States Supreme Court building. Look how similar they are to each other. This is not accidental. This is very intentional by the people who designed the Supreme Court building. And the people who actually chose this design are the members of the Supreme Court themselves. They're the ones that decided that they wanted to meet in a Greek temple. Now think about the symbolism of that. Why did people go to that building in ancient Greece? They went there to worship gods. Gods that would give them truth, who would give them direction in their life that they otherwise would not have. The Supreme Court, in choosing to design their building to look like that, wanted people to see them in a similar way, that they would come to them to have wisdom imparted to them that they would not otherwise have. Wisdom imparted from beings that are above them in some way, greater, more powerful than they are, so that then they will be obedient to them. The Supreme Court's efforts to symbolically present themselves in almost a religious way can be seen in their attire too. The judges on the United States Supreme Court wear robes. Now, who else in society wears robes? If you walked around the street in a robe, people think you're a crazy person. But there are certain occupations, certain times where you put on robes and people think it's normal. One of those is a minister in a church who may wear robes. Another is a professor at a university who may wear robes, such as graduation. And when we see people in those situations, we don't look at the robes and say they're wackos. Instead, we look at the robes and say, wow, they deserve respect. They've got some sort of education, knowledge, wisdom that's beyond me. Those robes symbolize that that person knows more than other people. They're an expert in some way that can share their knowledge. They're smarter than the rest of us, is what it kind of says. Well, judges, in choosing to wear robes, are presenting that same sort of idea to people. They're symbolic of them being the ones that have some sort of reservoir of truth that the rest of us don't have, that they can then give to us. This can also be seen in the language that the Supreme Court uses. Notice here we've got two Latin phrases, one used by the church and one used by the Supreme Court. Now, unless you have a background in Latin, you probably can't figure out what either of these say. Now, I'll just tell you that the one on the left from the church is saying, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. The one on the right from the court says that ignorance of the law is no excuse. Now, I knew you'd really wonder what they said, so I had to tell you. But the point is that you otherwise wouldn't know. And so just as a church may use language so that the people in the congregation think that they have to go to the priest to have things explained, that in order to get their knowledge of God, they have to go through the clergy. The court uses language that the rest of us can't understand. So again, to get our knowledge of the law, of the Constitution, whatever it may be, we have to go through the judges to get it. They become necessary and important to us. We look at them as being smarter, wiser, better than us in some ways. So the Supreme Court wants us to believe that they are the oracles of legal truth. Like the oracles, that's an ancient Greek phrase about you would go to a temple and there'd be oracles there that would impart wisdom from the gods to you. That's how the Supreme Court wants you to see them. They are the ones imparting the truth of the Constitution and the laws of the United States to us that we would otherwise not have. So by doing this, they nurture this idea that they have authority that we don't have, they have knowledge we don't have, they have wisdom that we don't have. And then because they have those things, when they pronounce things, they say the law is this, or the Constitution means that. We receive those things on faith, really. We don't know whether they're telling the truth or not. Most of us don't know how to go read and study and figure out whether their decisions are correct or incorrect. So we just assume, well, it's the Supreme Court that said that's in the Constitution. I guess it is. And then that provides moral certitude for us, just like a religion would. You accept the teachings, the doctrines of that religion on faith, and then that allows you to be certain of your moral position. You know what's right and what's wrong in your life, morally speaking. Well, the Supreme Court does the same thing legally speaking, constitutionally speaking. They tell us what's appropriate and what isn't, and we accept it. And that gives them power. Now, as they're nurturing these particular images, they have to defend themselves against contrary images. They don't want you to see them as different than what they're trying to present. This is one of the reasons why the Supreme Court doesn't allow any cameras in its courtroom. I mean, think about the kind of things that might be seen if they allowed cameras in the courtroom that could distract from this image of them being all-wise, all-knowing, deliverers of constitutional truth to us. One example is the Supreme Court justices on occasion. Remember, they get to be some old people there on the court, may even fall asleep during the oral arguments in the court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the oldest member of the Supreme Court, did this a few years ago. Fell asleep during their actual court session with somebody standing up there arguing. And as this person pointed out, a Supreme Court reporter, well, she's lucky that didn't happen with cameras rolling, or she would have become the butt of jokes. And that's the kind of thing that they're protecting themselves against. They don't want you to see them falling asleep. They don't want you to see them picking their nose or whatever it is, because then you might think that they're human, they're normal, they're average like the rest of us. They want to be seen as incredible, amazing, smarter, better, bigger, more powerful than the rest of us, because that then nurtures the impressions that they want us to have to make them be powerful. This desire for them to nurture the proper image to maintain their power also influences the decisions that they make as a court. Let's go back to the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey as an example. A few moments ago I told you that there's the potential in this case for them to overrule the Supreme Court's original decision in the field of abortion rights, Roe v. Wade. But they didn't. Well, part of the reason they didn't was this notion of nurturing their power. Here's a quote from the case where they say that to overrule Roe would cost them. It would do unnecessary damage to their legitimacy. Well, how so? A lot of people thought the decision was wrong. And it would seem that if they overruled it, it would make those people happy with the court then. But the court said, no. If we overrule that previous decision, we'll be seen as vacillating, as kind of flip-flopping on what we say the Constitution means. And that will destroy our legitimacy. So essentially what they're saying is they would rather be wrong than be seen as changing their minds. Now, why would that be? Why would they rather be wrong? With a few people that out there that actually study the Constitution, things like that, who could look at the decision and say, well, you know what, Roe v. Wade was... There's a few people out there like that, but most of the public is just accepting the Supreme Court's decisions on faith. So they would rather be incorrect in their past decision than be seen changing their minds. Because if they're seen changing their minds, that reveals that the decisions aren't really being made on what's in the Constitution. Instead, they're being made based on the bias of the members of the Supreme Court. And that then destroys our trust in them as an institution. They therefore, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, upheld Roe v. Wade as a way to protect their power. Now, does this mean they can never make controversial decisions? No, it doesn't. And we actually have an example from fairly recent Supreme Court history to illustrate this. Earlier in this course, we mentioned the same-sex marriage decision of the United States Supreme Court, Obergefell versus Hodges, in that the Supreme Court ruled that there was a constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry throughout the United States of America. Now, let's look at the state of same-sex marriage before this decision. Here's a map showing where same-sex marriage was legal or illegal in the country. The couple of states in red, same-sex marriage had been approved by voters. In the 5 6 states in green, I guess it was 7 by this point, legislatures had legalized gay marriage. But in the other states across the country, 41 of them, or 40, maybe it is, I'm losing count now, but anyway, a vast majority of the states, same-sex marriages had been democratically banned by the people, either through state laws passed or state constitutional amendments. Matter of fact, most of the states had constitutional amendments that had been passed by the voters saying same-sex marriage will not be recognized in this state. So across the vast swath of America, the voters had spoken and said, we don't want same-sex marriage. So what happened then was, with the Supreme Court's ruling, notice that my little title down in the lower left-hand corner changed for the gray states. The Supreme Court's ruling legalized gay marriage throughout the country. It essentially overruled the voice of the people in these 40 other states. Now that's an awfully controversial thing for them to do. Well, if they're so worried about people's perceptions of them, how could they feel that they get away with something like that? Well, here's the explanation from a lower court judge. The Supreme Court can maintain its legitimacy even when it does these controversial activist opinions, as long as it's keeping elite opinion happy. Okay? Elite opinion are the ones who are most likely to really understand what the court is doing, perhaps even have studied the Constitution themselves, have some perception of what's really going on. And as long as the court's decisions are serving the biases of those people, they'll be okay if the court's a little activist. And what's going to happen to all the rest of the people? Well, they're probably ignorant of what's going on. They look at the Supreme Court as this semi-religious institution, as we described earlier in this lesson. They end up taking the Supreme Court's decisions on faith. So if the Supreme Court says there's a right to gay marriage in the Constitution, they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, I guess there's a right to gay marriage in the Constitution. It's only the elites that would really question it. And as long as what the Supreme Court is doing keeps them happy, they can still maintain their legitimacy along the way. And elite opinion in the United States of America at this time was overwhelmingly in favor of same-sex marriage. And so the Supreme Court's decision was just accepted by them. It was lauded by them at the time. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What is the source of the Supreme Court's power? Is it that it has a police force? Is it that it spends extravagant amount of money? Is it that it has certain public perceptions? Or is it the Constitution's text? The Supreme Court's power is found in the perceptions that the public have of it. How does the court create a religious-like respect for what it does? Is it in the clothing the court wears, the architecture of its building, the language it uses, or in the media coverage of it? It's actually in all these aspects. The Supreme Court dresses in robes like priests. They meet in a temple. They speak in language that most people don't understand. And they even control what people are allowed to see or not see of them on the evening news. They're doing this to generate a certain image that people respect, almost like they would a religious institution. Why does the court avoid being seen changing its mind? Is it that the rules don't allow them to change their mind? Is it that the Constitution forbids them from changing their mind? Is it that Congress would overrule them if they changed their mind? Or is it that they would lose trust? The answer is they would lose trust. If we as the public saw them flip-flopping, we'd come to realize that their decisions were just based on their personal biases, rather on this faithful notion that they're just telling us what the Constitution says. Whose opinion does the court follow? The president, the founding fathers, social elites, or the voters? The Supreme Court pays attention to the opinions of social elites, not the masses of the country, but the intellectual leaders of the country. Okay, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will be from Unit 7 also, it'll be Lesson 14, about checking the power of the courts.